Hey man, pull out your phone.
Okay.
Ask Claude who it's named after.
Hey, Claude, who are you named after? It's being a little cagey.
Yeah, well, take this.
Okay.
It's never been officially confirmed, but ask anyone in the industry, you get the same answer, the same first name. A man that worked right here.
So you're telling me the most famous AI on Earth is named after a guy no one knows about?
Yup, and by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly who he was. And I'll make the argument right now, he shapes your daily life more than Albert Einstein. Remember this pond?
This is Einstein's pond.
Exactly, but the pond actually came later, but it doesn't matter because he was definitely in that building. That was Einstein's office and later Oppenheimer's too. And our guy Claude Shannon, he was here in 1940 as a 24-year-old.
Wait, so at 24 years old, he was in this building working with the world's most famous scientist?
Not exactly. He had a fellowship down the hall from the most famous scientist alive.
Okay, so who is this guy and how does he start working with Einstein?
Great question. He's a nerd prodigy from a small town in Michigan. And as a kid, he built his own telegraph line to a friend's house a half a mile away, using the barbed wire fence between the farms as the telegraph wire.
Okay, so he texted his friend through a fence. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's in the 1920s. Fast forward to the 1930s, he's at MIT where he's going to solve his first ever world-changing problem.
His first.
His first.
So he's going to go on to solve more.
Exactly. But this one sets up the next ones, so I'll have to explain it a bit. Back then, when you made a call, a human operator had to physically plug your line into the right socket. And what he or she was really doing with that plug was completing a path for electricity to flow between your phone and your friend's phone. That path is called a circuit. By the 1930s, phone companies were trying to automate their job with room-sized mechanical switching machines. Thousands of switches, each one a tiny automatic version of the plug, opening and closing paths on their own. But there was no math yet for designing circuits like this.
Okay, so how did he actually build them then?
It's the same thing I do with IKEA furniture. Trial and error.
No. Did you just admit that you can't actually build IKEA furniture?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
Back,
Anyways, back to the switching machine. Engineers would build it. It misbehaved, so they rewired it and basically just prayed.
So the whole thing was built on vibes.
Educated vibes. And at 21 years old, Shannon is working on a room-sized mechanical switching machine at MIT, and he notices something nobody else had put together. An old, dusty branch of logic from the 1800s by George Boole.
Boole. That sounds like Boolean from coding class a while ago.
I totally thought you were going to say like Boolean, but yes, Boolean from coding class, not Anyways, Boole showed that any statement breaks down to just true or false, chained together with ands and ors. And Shannon saw that a switch is the exact same idea, just built out of wire instead of words. It's either on or off.
Okay, break that down for me.
Got you. Think about what a switching machine actually has to decide. Connect this call if the line is free and the caller dialed a real number. That sentence already has a logic in it, the word and. Now build that sentence out of hardware. One switch that closes when the line is free, a second switch that closes when the number is real. Wire them in a row, and electricity can only get through when both are closed. The current flowing is the machine saying yes.
And what about or?
Great question. To do an OR statement, put the two switches side by side instead, on parallel paths, and the current only gets through if either one closes.
Can you give me an or example too, like you did with and?
Sure. Connect this call if the caller dials extension 5 or extension 6. Same operator picks up either way. Wire those two switches side by side, and current gets through the moment either one closes. So look at what we just did. Any decision you can write as a sentence. Ands, ors, you can now build out of switches.
Okay, so the wire is actually doing all of the thinking instead of guessing your way to a working circuit, and Claude figured out that you can just do the math.
Yeah, basically, you can find the answer before you build it. And he wrote it up in his master's thesis in 1937 at just 21 years old. And it's still today routinely called the most important master's thesis ever written, because that trick, switches doing logic, is what every chip in every device on Earth is doing right now, billions of times a second.
Okay, so you're telling me the reward for the greatest master's thesis in all of mankind is an office near Einstein.
Exactly. So thesis was done in 1937, and by 1940, his reward lands him right where we're standing. Problem 2, and it might be the highest stakes of the entire series so far, so you gotta pay attention, okay? During World War II, President Roosevelt and Winston Churchill are talking across the Atlantic to plan the entire war. And they're using a radio phone system that's scrambled, or so they thought. because the Nazis have cracked it.
So they're essentially listening to their conversations and planning the entire war, right?
Yeah, pretty much the most important conversations. Roughly for about 2 years, a German listening post off the Dutch coast is listening in, transcribing the calls, and unscrambling the messages. Huge problem, and that's a problem that this company at this office was handed.
This office.
Yeah.
Why? What's the special here?
Yeah.
Like,
So
what?
a whole lot of juicy science history happened here between the 20s and 40s that we covered.
Juicy.
We covered it in the first episode, so make sure you watch.
You're the only person ever in the history of mankind to call science juicy.
Yeah.
Okay, come on. But I'll try to explain the juicy science here and keep me honest.
Please.
Essentially, for half a century, this building was the headquarters of Bell Labs, which was the research arm for the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, or better known as AT&T. It was the company that ran every telephone in America, and it was essentially a monopoly so big it could afford to hire the smartest people alive and let them chase their dreams.
That's exactly it. Dude, I am so proud of you. And this company recruits our guy off the Princeton campus like they do with a whole bunch of other geniuses. And in 1943, this is where the government brings that whole President Roosevelt spying problem too.
So Claude Shannon is sitting in a room. They bring him this problem.
Yep.
What does he do?
The answer is a machine called Sig Sally. It was 50 tons of equipment, so super heavy, and the first system ever to turn a human voice into digits, encrypt it, and then send them. And the man whose job to prove mathematically that it couldn't be broken?
Claude Shannon.
Claude Shannon. And in 1943, Alan Turing.
Wait. Alan Turing from before, he's the code breaker from the movie.
Yes, exactly. Okay. That's the one. And he visits Bell Labs. And Claude Shannon and Alan Turing have tea in this cafeteria of this building repeatedly. But both are working on the most classified projects of the entire war. So neither is allowed to say a word about it. And instead, the fathers of the digital age talk about whether machines could ever think.
If machines can think translates to artificial intelligence, but in 1943?
I know, it's wild. And all over a cup of tea, because everything else was illegal. And when the war ends, Claude Shannon is going to solve the third thing that this episode's about. But for this one, he needs to go quiet.
Go quiet as in classified?
Not really. Quiet as in it's a challenge so complex and so consuming it takes his whole mind and he has to lock himself up in his own apartment.
Can't say I've ever done that, but for how long?
For the better part of a decade, up here on the third floor of this apartment building. That is where Claude Shannon lived for most of his 20s and 30s, just a few blocks from the office where you're at.
So this is where the genius kid lived like a monk.
The opposite, actually. This was a bachelor pad where he had a record player turned up too loud, he stayed out late nights at jazz clubs, and he even played chess against the Hustlers in Washington Square Park, just a few minute walk from here.
So this guy actually sounds pretty sick. He doesn't sound like a nerd, I'll be honest.
Yeah, I agree. And that's where he would come back late at night, lock himself up in a room, working on a problem that nobody assigned to him, and most people didn't even know he was working on.
Which was?
The third problem. And it sounds pretty fake. In the 1940s, nobody on Earth could measure information. What is a message? Is a photo more information than a song? How much can a wire actually carry? The biggest company in the world and the entire communications industry at the time were building a network for a substance it could not define or measure.
So that's like running an oil company without actually knowing what a barrel is.
That's a great way of putting it. And in July 1948, in Bell Labs' own internal journal, Claude publishes about 80 pages that ends the confusion permanently. Everything from voice to pictures to music to video, it's all the same stuff.
How so? Because if I counted correctly, that was 4 different things you just named.
Yes, but it was all information, and information has a universal unit. And to show you that unit, we're going to play a game.
A game, you say?
Yes.
I love games.
Think of any famous person. I only get yes or no questions, and I bet you I can get it less than 5 questions.
Less than 5. Okay, I got the person.
Okay. Is that person alive?
No.
Okay. Is it a man?
Yes.
Is that man a famous scientist?
Yes.
Did we stand outside of his office earlier today?
This is rigged.
Albert Einstein?
Get out of here, man.
See what I just did there? Every yes or no answer cut the world of possibilities roughly in half. Alive or dead, half gone. Man or woman, half again. Each answer is the smallest possible piece of information that exists. One yes or no. And Shannon called it a binary digit. or you might better recognize it as its famous name we hear today called a bit.
Okay, so if I have this correct, a bit isn't just this thing that lives inside of a computer. It's actually like this binary conclusion of yes or no.
I like it. And here's the leap. Any message, this sentence, a photo, a song, can be turned into a string of yeses or nos, which means everything can be measured in bits, sent as bits, and even stored as bits.
All right, I don't see the connection here. Like, why does a phone company who literally just worries about making phone calls care about the bit?
Yeah, because Claude took it a step further. He didn't stop at just defining it. He proved two other things, and they're the reason why your life works right now. The first one is that any message is guessable.
All right, I don't believe it.
How did I know you're going to say that?
Maybe you know me.
I came prepared. Index card. I want you to read it, okay?
Can't be that hard.
Let's see.
Give me this thing. You can read this sentence without any vowels.
Honestly, way better than I thought you were going to do, okay? And the reason you can read it is because English is about 75% redundant. Every vowel I deleted was information you never needed because your brain fills in anything guessable. That's compression. Skip everything the receiver could guess and send only the surprises.
All right, so the first thing he figures out is compression. What's next?
Noise. And the explanation starts way simpler than you think. It's just me and you having a conversation. If we look at the sentences really closely, like super close, it starts as a thought in my head. That's the source. I turn it into words. That's the message. My mouth then transmits it into a sound. That's the signal. It travels through the air between us. That's the channel. And your ears receive the sound. And the destination is when your brain turns it back into the thought.
All right, so that's a lot of stops, literally just for one sentence.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter the sentence. It can be a dumb sentence like, yo, what's up? To a really smart sentence. It will make the same stops every time. But here's the problem. The journey isn't safe. If a truck rolls by mid-sentence, that's a noise source, and it attacks the signal in the channel. So what arrives at your ears is not what left my mouth because a piece got smudged on the way. And Shannon's move proved that every type of communication, no matter what, is the same exact picture.
All right, let me try with a phone call. My thoughts become words. My phone transmits them as an electrical signal. The wire, which is the channel, and then there's static inside the wire, which is the noise, and your phone receives it, and then your brain gets the message.
You got it. So a phone call, a radio broadcast, a TV signal, all of it. Something sends, something carries, something receives, and somewhere in the middle, noise attacks. So he drew that map we've been showing, which is probably the most copied diagram in the history of engineering. And Claude wanted to solve the big problem that's on every single trip. The noise standing in the middle of the road. And for 50 years, everybody in communications believed that's just the price of distance. Noise just wins and errors pile up. So your only defense is just shouting louder. But Shannon proved that's wrong. And it's something that you already do.
That I already do. What are you talking about?
You do it, but you just haven't realized you've done it. Okay, say you're on a bad phone connection and you try spelling your name. Do you say just the letter B?
B. Last time I checked, there's no B in Jared.
You're right. Just go with it.
Just go with it.
Yes.
Okay, I would say B as in Bravo.
Exactly. Bravo is longer than B. So you're adding extra carefully chosen information, and now the static can eat half the word, and the other person still knows with certainty it's a B. And Shannon proved that you can do that mathematically to any message. Weave in the right kind of smart redundancy, and the receiver can still spot the smudge bits and repair them on arrival. Not approximately, but you can do it perfectly. And as long as you don't try to talk faster than the channel speed limit, a limit that he calculated exactly for every wire and every signal on Earth, you can push a message through a filthy channel essentially flawlessly. So that's why a spacecraft, even though it's hundreds of millions of miles away, can send a picture through all that static and it arrives perfectly.
Okay, so to package this all up, AT&T was selling something that they couldn't measure before.
Yep.
They hire Claude. He measures this for them. But then not only does he do that, he shows them how to compress it, like shrink it down.
Yep.
And then beat static, everything that comes in the line with math, which sounds crazy. And then not only does he do that, he packages it all up into this like notebook for the entire industry.
Yeah, and it's basically the playbook for the industry and every industry after that, because the internet today still runs on it. Back to the car. Now let's quickly count up his wins. First, he rewired how circuits are designed at age 21.
Then he helped secure the most important phone line of the war in his mid-20s.
And then invented the science of information at age 32.
So really, he was young and just getting started.
Yeah, but then he pretty much stopped.
What do you mean he stopped?
So we're back at the office we started at. Bell Labs, the research company that Shannon worked for, opened this Murray Hill campus back in 1941. And earth-shattering inventions were already pouring out of it. So everyone moved out here but Claude. He held out at his Manhattan apartment for 8 more years. And what finally pulled him out in 1949 wasn't the company.
Let me guess, it was love.
Yep, he got married to Betty Moore, a mathematician at the labs. And once the most cited mind of the century shows up in his new office, he basically retires from the frontier and just messes around.
I mean, at this point, he had so much clout, he could probably get away with it.
Yeah, except his colleagues genuinely worried that he was wasting one of the great brains of history. But here's the thing. He was never chasing importance. Every single thing he did, including the paper, he did because he was curious.
Okay, I totally respect that though, but what was he actually spending his time on? It couldn't have been nothing.
Yeah, well, wasting time looked like this. In 1950, he builds Theseus, a mechanical mouse that learns its way through a maze and remembers, which you can make a real case is the opening move of machine learning.
So he was messing around and pioneered machine learning. Kind of different people here.
Yep, and he gets quietly rich, because by most accounts, he was pretty good at picking stocks, just like everything else.
I'm starting to get a little bit jealous of this Claude guy.
And in 1961, he and a colleague built a computer small enough to hide on your body, to do what anyone would do with that kind of power back then. Go to Vegas and beat the roulette tables.
So the first wearable computer was built to beat a casino.
Built by the father of the information theory to win at roulette, just for fun.
Okay, and how does this story end? I feel like it's probably jail, but...
Quietly. It's a sad note, and we'll hit it once and leave it alone. Alzheimer's. The man who taught the world how to store and transmit memory spent his last years tragically losing his own. He died in 2001, right as the world he described was fully arriving. So, the title. I'm not telling you he was smarter than Einstein. That's not the claim.
Then what are you claiming?
Einstein rewrote the universe, and you touch his work a handful of times a day, mostly when the GPS corrects the blue dot on Find My Friends. But Claude's work, you're touching right now. Every text is bits. Every photo is compression. Every call survives noise because of his math. You will use Einstein's work on your drive home, but you've used Shannon's work 400 times since this video started.
So how is he more important than Einstein?
To your Tuesday, it's not even close. And it's fitting the most famous AI on Earth quietly carries the name of the person who saw it all coming over a cup of tea in 1943.
Okay, so help me out here. How does that make him so important to my Tuesday?
Good question, and here's the answer. The math is only half the story. There's another piece that is the reason that all of this actually reaches your Tuesday. See, in 1948, there is no machine on Earth that can actually run this math at scale. The switches are still the glass tubes we talked about in episode 1, and they burn out like light bulbs. The device that can do it, the one that makes Shannon's whole universe physically possible,
Let me guess, it was invented here.
about 200 feet behind us, 7 months before the famous Claude paper even hit print, by 3 men in one afternoon, changed the world, and then spent the rest of their lives hating each other over it.
That's genuinely sad.
It is. There's even a photograph of them from that winter, all smiles, posed at the lab bench. But it might be the most passive-aggressive photograph in the history of science, because the man that is front and center, his name isn't on the patent of the invention that changes humanity forever.
Oof, it's gotta hurt.
It did. And the grudge is the reason why Silicon Valley exists 3,000 miles away from right here. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next 6 episodes of our Bell Labs series.